National Treasury has reluctantly agreed to another bailout for the struggling national airline South African Airways. 10.4 billion rand must now be found somewhere in the fiscus. My name is David Ansara of the Centre for Risk Analysis, and joining me today is CRA analyst Nicholas Babaya to discuss this topic in more detail. Nicholas, welcome to the CRA channel.
Hello, David, and thanks for having me on today.
So now, Nicholas, what are the implications of this decision, particularly in terms of a broader policy perspective, but also what it demonstrates about the ideological convictions of the current government?
Yes, David. Well, I think this is quite an astounding decision. The fact of the matter is that civil aviation industry all over the globe is really suffering. South African Airways has not made a profit in nearly a decade, as you just said. And it looked like earlier this year, this might be the end of the airline. The game was finally up after multiple turnaround strategies. Things might finally be coming to an end. But I think the takeaway from this is that the ideological conviction in the ANC to have a state hand in running the economy is so strong that they are just very keen on continuing these bailouts and continuing to keep the state-run enterprise afloat. There's almost no economic argument these days, at least, to keep the state-run airline in a country. In the 2000s and the 90s, South African Airways took up a very large market share of the civil aviation industry in South Africa that has shrunk rapidly in the face of cheaper, low-cost carriers. And quite frankly, this ends up just being a subsidy for a fairly luxury form of transport to the country, and spending billions of rands while doing that. And what needs to be understood here is that these billions of rands could have been spent on other things. So we are now diverting, ever smaller taxpayer revenue to subsidizing a form of transport that is primarily used for the rich, run by a company that cannot make a profit. So economically speaking, it's quite maddening. And I think it really points to the ideological convictions of the ANC. And unfortunately, the conclusion or one of the readings of this might simply be that the prospects for reform at the moment are very slim. If the ANC is really intent on continuing to do this, I think it really shows that the ideological leanings are very deeply held, and it's going to take a lot, if anything at all, to get the ANC off the course of having the state have its hand in the economy like this.
Nicholas, what do you think this says for reform prospects broadly within the ANC and within the government, particularly with regards to tensions within the government, within cabinet? Seems that Tito Mboweni, the finance minister, has reluctantly signed off on this bailout package. But that is obviously, in terms of the trade-offs that are going to have to be made within the medium-term budget, there are going to be some cuts elsewhere in the budget that's going to have negative impact on other government spending priorities. So what do you think this suggests about internal tensions within the government?
Yes, David. Well, I think we know very well that the country's deficit has run up enormously as a result of the economic lockdown. Economically, there's very little good to say at the moment. And so spending an extra 10.4 billion on a failing airline is probably one of the last things that the Treasury would have wanted to do. But I think it's clear that Tito Mboweni and the more reformists in the ANC are not in control here. They've probably been very reluctant, at least that's what some news reports have said, to do this. And quite frankly, I think it shows that the more state capture side of the ANC is really intent on shoring up its patronage network. Now, I must say, I think another reading of this is that, we've observed at the Centre for Risk Analysis that ANC performance in elections correlates very closely to how well the country does economically. In the 2000s, under Mbeki and Mandela, when the country's economy was growing, when a lot of people were being lifted out of poverty, a lot of people were being given houses and electricity and running water, the ANC's voter share actually increased a lot. But under the Zuma and Ramaphosa years, that has been patently the opposite. And we have an election coming up next year. That's a local government election where the ANC traditionally doesn't do very well because a lot of the local municipalities in this country are very poorly run. And I think the ANC sees now that it has this great chance of having a very poor performance in next year's election. And so one reading of this could be that the ANC is trying to keep its support in spite of the dire economic situation in the country. And one way of doing this is by milking the state resources and distributing them to its cadres and to its network to just try and keep those voters afloat. Of course, that is a bit of speculation, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of data to back that up, and there's almost no reason otherwise to keep the state-owned airline around. Quite frankly, this is just an airline. This is not something so deeply vital to the economy, which the private sector isn't already providing.
Nicholas, what do you think this move also suggests in terms of the broader fiscal policy position of the government? We see a 700 billion rand deficit projected for this financial year, debt to GDP in excess of 80%. What are some of the longer term risks of these kind of ongoing bailouts, continued borrowing?
Yes, David. Well, I think the unfortunate thing is that it just is yet another sign that any kind of semblance of fiscal conservatism in the government, if it does exist, is being crowded out by other elements within the ANC. The fact of the matter is that our state of the government coffers are really not good at the moment, as you've just mentioned those figures. And you really would want to be cutting back on things that are not very necessary, especially not necessary to the poorest South Africans. So, as I mentioned before, this is a luxury form of transport. You can get anywhere within South Africa by taking a bus or by taking some other means of transport that's much cheaper. People might make the argument that it boosts the economy, but especially in a world with COVID-19, we don't know to what extent we're going to have international travel. So I think, in terms of the broader prospects for South Africa's fiscal situation, I think it just shows that the willingness it's going to take a lot for the government to actually muster the political will to cut back on expenses, and especially things which to us may seem totally unnecessary, like a state-run airline that hasn't made a profit in 10 years. To the ANC, there are very political reasons for keeping things like this around. And so it's going to take a great deal of political will if we are ever going to see actually cutting down on some of this kind of unnecessary spending. Whether or not it's possible, I suppose we shouldn't rule it out. But I think as long as the ANC has this kind of mentality that the state needs to lead its role in the economy and that it needs to muster up its support through its distribution networks, which often go through these SAEs, I think the prospects for serious fiscal reform and cutting back on unnecessary spending are quite low, at least for the time being. Hopefully, whatever reformist elements within the ANC will gain a louder voice. But right now, they seem to be totally crowded out.
Nicholas, thank you very much for your insight and your analysis on this topic. This is something that we covered in our weekly risk alert as well. So if you would like to receive that alert via email and WhatsApp, you can follow the link in the description below, which will entitle you to a 30-day free trial of the CRA. Please do remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and also share it on your social media platforms. Let us know what you think in the comment section below. Do you think SAA is a going concern? What is the outcome going forward? Have you had an experience on SAA that you'd like to share from a consumer perspective? Do post it in the comment section below and join us tomorrow for the next video. Until then, take care.